I like watching Gremlin a lot, and I watched him watch it on his channel, and I also watched it by myself because I was very excited about it. But we're also going to watch it. Angola, if you don't know, is a prison in America that basically does slave labor, essentially. So we're going to watch that. So if you're not in the mood for some more serious subject matter, you can go ahead and get out of here, hop on a skip. But I am interested in abolitional politics, so I feel like, quote a little bit from this book, probably, maybe even. They bring up prisoners in this as well. But yeah, okay. Are we ready? Are we ready? Let's go.
We are pulling up to Angola State Penitentiary right now, aka the farm, aka the plantation, aka John Brown's worst nightmare.
I believe this video was edited by Oni Spumoni as well, right? Great music as well. They chose great music for this. Sounds very Red Dead. Cinematography is by Cinemarxism as well. There are lots of people we know. Also voices we all know as well. Jeremy Aaron, Doodlebub as well, and Sean Black.
One wants to live here. The fanfare and tourism might be an illusion, but it's right here, just around the corner. And it keeps getting worse. It's a state of dreams, and we're all big dreamers. It's no secret that the American prison system is an amalgamation of man-made horrors beyond your comprehension. Many of the most egregious violators of human rights are well known and even glamorized in media. Alcatraz, Rikers Island, Butcher Bay, the offices of Dan Schneider. These are some of the most terrifying prisons in the US, where 25% of the world's incarcerated population exists, despite only 5% of the global population being in the US.
Just wild. Just a wild statistic. Just insane. The US has so many people in prison. The US has so many fucking people in prison. Why? You know why. It's an industry. I actually lived in Louisiana for 7 years. That was not a fun place to live, but honestly, some of the best people live there too. I mean, that's the thing, right? That's usually what's gonna happen, right? It's like places that are hard to live in and situations that are hard to live in typically produce very empathetic people. We know statistically as well, the poor are more charitable than the rich, and this is because when you experience poverty, you know what it's like and you know how hard life gets.
Originally a collection of 4 contiguous slave plantations named after the very country that its slaves were stolen from.
Okay.
The property along the Mississippi River was...
The prison, Angola, is named after the country that the slaves were stolen from. Okay, because it was built on top of an old plantation. And now the fucking prison is named after the same thing. Like, Angola, that's where all the fucking slaves were from. That's so grim, dude.
Was leased to a Confederate Major Samuel Lawrence James in 1869 to operate as a convict leasing facility.
As well, convict leasing facility.
The Louisiana
not owning
building.
People, leasing them.
But a legacy
I mean,
of
both,
slavery and nepotistic
right?
appointments.
Leasing out that ownership to others.
Over this. While there is a rich history of emancipatory movements and the fight against exploitation, no state comes even close to incarceration, poverty, crumbling infrastructure, and economic.
Exactly, it's just the most blatant example. Abolish prisons, dude. We'll speak about it a little bit later, but like, I've just finished listening to the Serial podcast about Guantanamo Bay. Just the fact that like we're okay with treating people in these awful conditions. Something that really struck me about listening to the Guantanamo Bay podcast was that like prisoners would occasionally launch like revolts. And again, for context, Guantanamo Bay was set up so that people could be held captive without ever being charged of a crime. Obama era, we tortured some folks. They would do protests in the form of hunger strikes, because that's the only resource that they have, and then they would eventually be force-fed. They were often asking for just like minor improvements in their conditions. Like they were asking to have lights turned off in their room, because most of the prisoners were kept in environments where the lights were turned on 24/7. And then when the prisoners got some of the things that they requested, and then they also finally asked like, hey, so when are we getting out? They were like, oh no, we can't do that. And the guy that they spoke to, the prison employee who they spoke to, who was kind of trying to work with the prisoners on improving their own conditions, seemed genuinely hurt that the prisoners wanted to be let out? I put so much effort into improving your conditions and now you're wanting to be let out? There were so many people that they interviewed where the people were like, I can't believe these protesters are just like, they won't eat, the prison's gonna close at this point. And it's like, yeah, that's the fucking point, dude. Like, I won't describe what they do for the force feeding, but it is extremely painful. It's extremely invasive. Like, they would do force feeding under the guise of like, well, if they don't eat, they're gonna die. And I think a lot of the prisoners are just like, dying is what is better than this. But it's also just so grim because the hunger strikes are the only way that they have to protest, right? There's something really, really dehumanizing about even taking away their right to be hungry and force feeding them. This is the only tool that they have in order to protest, is to put themselves at risk.
2019 report showed that Angola has the highest per capita death rate of any prison in the U.S. Many of the medical staff were found to have had their medical license revoked and are still employed here. A recent ProPublica report on Angola's inhumane medical...
What the fuck? Have the highest death rate
medical staff were found
in the
to
US.
have had their medical license revoked and are still employed here.
And the medical staff have had their licenses revoked, but they still work there. Maybe that's why the deaths are so high.
A paralyzed
Seems like
man
it's an intended
who was put in a
consequence.
small
Yeah.
dark room as punishment
Oopsie
for
doopsie,
protesting
people
his
died
inhumane medical treatment
after we killed
with no
them.
medical staff to care.
Racism hides from view within institutional structures, and its most reliable refuge is the prison system.
A tiered
I'm sure that's an Angela Davis quote, which if you haven't read any Angela Y. Davis has written a lot on the topic of feminism and classism and black politics and also prison politics in particular. But if you're looking for something to read, Race, Women, and Class, I think, is the book by Angela Davis.
When you arrive at Angola, you're sent out into the fields to plant and harvest a variety of crops from peppers, okra, strawberries, and cotton.
Cotton picking, huh? We're gonna send a bunch of prisoners, mostly black men, because this is the way that incarceration works, as it disproportionately affects minorities. You're gonna send them to do cotton farming. Like, that looks an awful lot like, you know, something else. For those who don't know what the 13th Amendment is, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, where the party shall duly be convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. They're paid literal pennies. Exactly. As Gremlo said, like, it's so obviously evil, where it's like clearly the pennies that they're paid is so obviously just in an attempt to say, well, it's not slavery, right? Because they are paid for their labor. It's so clearly just to get around, you know, so that people aren't just like, oh, well, this is blatantly slavery. Obviously in the US, like, it's in your fucking constitution. And then you have Americans out here. This really gets my goat, because I think LB's talked about this before, right? Is that South Africa has a really good constitution. Even if we don't apply everything in our very good constitution to the way that we practically run the country, the fact is that legally people's rights are protected. And then you have like Americans out here being like, oh, our constitution is everything, acting like our constitution is the fucking holy gospel. In a weird way, it kind of pisses me off, because I'm like, man, your constitution isn't even good.
But don't worry, prisoners who qualify are allowed 1 weekend a year to take part in the Angola Prison Rodeo. That's right, kids. Come on down to the Angola Rodeo back in time this weekend and watch these modern-day gladiators get gored by 2,000-pound bulls, suplex cows, and shit their pants in a pretend card game with a raging bull and get dragged by a horse, trying not to spill some Kool-Aid. Yes, a prison rodeo.
Wow.
We're talking about a prison where 75% of its population are black and brown men on the grounds of a former and, let's be honest, current slave plantation, engaging in blood sport for the entertainment of thousands. And we just allow this.
It's just not a good look, you know? It's...
Sure.
I mean, that's so obvious, right? And that's the thing, right? That is the thing about capitalism, is that they don't have to care, right? If they have their fingers in enough pies, it gets to the point where they don't have to care about the politics of it. They don't have to care about the optics of it, right? Because, as he said, like, kids are growing up in Louisiana, extremely racialized minority communities, then over-policed, and then they end up in prison, that then sort of, like, help continue to fund the system. The prison system funds the petrochemical system. It is just a never-ending loop of free labor that Louisiana produces from the kids that they underfund to have a good schooling experience, that end up getting arrested for petty crime and then ending up in this fucking shithole.
Please think about that. The state with the highest prison population, with prisons that sit atop slave plantations being...
Because it's just fucking free labor, man. They've landed themselves in such a sweet spot in terms of just free labor and a society that is underfunded so that you just keep having this continuous supply of people going to prison and providing free labor, it is the perfect capitalist system for them.
The man who was executed using nitrogen gas was strapped to a gurney where for 20 minutes he suffocated, gasped, and writhed in pain.
This is so an interesting section in a book that I read recently. It wasn't specifically about the death penalty, but it did have a large section on the death penalty. Like, execution is a whole industry, right? Think about there's people profiting from doing those executions as well, providing those execution methods as well. But also, if you've ever thought about who does the executions, there's no such job as an executioner. That's not a thing. Prisons will basically have like sort of like roster of 4 or 5 of their prison staff, their prison guard staff, to be executioners. And then they basically kind of like work on a rota of doing executions. And this is prison guards where they're taking care of people in the prison system, ideally supposed to be looking out for people's safety, and then they're being also tasked with executing them. One of the ways that they do this, right, is again by creating a false sense of class division, by making it seem like you have a lot less in common with a prisoner than you have with like your neighbor, by dehumanizing prisoners, characterizing them as, you know, people who have done something bad and can never come back from that, etc. There's this kind of a fear of people who have been to prison even for non-violent crimes. And then there's also just this dehumanizing that we do. You know, we do the work, we consume the propaganda, and then we do the work. A lot of us just dehumanize prisoners to the point that we don't see what we have in common with prisoners, which is actually quite a lot in terms of like, a prison is the most extreme form living under the boot. As like working class people trying to thrive in a system that is not designed for us to thrive in, we have more in common with people who are in prison than we have with like multi-billionaires. And that's the thing that capitalism is trying to prevent you from seeing. They are trying to convince you that you have, also by using racial divides as well, by saying you have more in common with the overwhelmingly white billionaire class than you have in common with the overwhelmingly black and racialized people in the prison system, who again are there because of racism. That's the other thing as well, right? Is we're also taught that we have to think we have more in common with police than we have in common with prisoners. And I think this is also something that the protests are having an impact on us, is a lot of us are seeing just fucking regular fucking average Joe Schmo students. And we're just seeing like regular people arrested, and all of a sudden we're kind of seeing the class difference between like ourselves and the police in terms of them just being a tool of the state. That's why it's important for us white people to stand with protests, 100%. It's why it's important for us to stand with people of color when they protest, is because we're a lot less likely to be arrested. It looks bad for the police, and it looks bad for the authoritarian powers. It looks bad when we get arrested, because now it seems like an overexertion of power, right? So it is really, really important to support, especially if you are white. It is so important for us to support the protests and to support BLM and these kind of movements where they are overall or like very, very largely sort of racialized. But we have to stand there, because otherwise the racialized members of those protesters will get picked on. People forgive that. When they see it, they forgive it. They see it as the system working as intended. But when someone like me gets arrested, they're going to think, hang on, this doesn't look like the system working as intended. This looks like an overexertion of power, which is fucked up. It shouldn't be that way. There shouldn't be a difference between me getting arrested and a black person of the same age and class and situation and whatever college getting arrested. Is because not only is it more voices, not only does it also make the movement seem more general and applicable to everyone, but it also makes those overexertions of state power extremely obvious to the people who are witnessing it. And it makes it really sort of a wake-up call for people who are seeing it. This is why they're using words like woke mobs and libs to make it sound like they're a different group of people, not just people who want change. Yeah, they've been talking about them in lots of different ways, right? They have characterized them as both highly organized and terrorist adjacent, but they have also characterized them as ignorant, not knowing any better, misinformed, lied to. American government, which is it? Are the students stupid fucking woke libs who don't know any better, who have no critical thinking skills and just consume whatever is told to them? Or are they hyper-organized and mobile terrorists with a manifesto and an agenda? Because you can't have both. But they need the fear from one, they need the fear of the terrorists from one, and they need to say that, don't look into it, okay? These kids just don't know what they're talking about. They're believing stupid propaganda, okay? They need the implied ignorance of the other.
Here's the part of the video where I say scary words like abolition, defund the police,
Ugh.
systemic racism, collective ownership, and progressive taxation.
Jesus!
And we've only scratched the surface of a seemingly very complicated
Very
issue
scary words.
of policing and incarceration. The purpose of any system is what it does. If policing primarily occupies black and brown and immigrant and poor communities, if 75% of prisoners come from those communities, if the 13th Amendment allows for slavery as punishment for a crime, and if the consequence of maintaining those systems is that your kids go to school every day in underfunded, crumbling schools, maybe that's not an accident.
Maybe that's intentional. I think as much as possible, I would encourage everyone, even if you don't necessarily learn more about prison abolition or abolitionist politics in general, I would encourage everyone to learn more about prisons and prisoners, because humanizing prisoners for yourself and humanizing prisons for yourself, which is an inherently dehumanized process, I think is really important in terms of accessing a level of empathy which you may not have access to just yet, because a lot of people just don't think about it. A lot of people will be lucky enough in their life that they never have to think about the prison system. They never have to think about friends or family or loved ones who are in the prison system, and they never have to worry themselves about being in the prison system. So it's something a lot of us never think about because we are never forced to empathize with it, because it's often, you know, associated with class, that a lot of us are lucky enough that we may never have to think about. Yeah, but if you are interested in abolitionist politics as well, I think it's also very important to remember that racism is a constructed idea. It is not natural. It is not an innate concept. It's not an innate way to divide society. And without abolishing prison, you cannot abolish racism. Abolishing prisons is a necessary part, a step to abolishing racism, because prisons are inherently racialized. They inherently prey on racialized communities and minority communities. So without abolishing one, you're not going to manage to abolish the other. They are inextricably linked, and we know this because of places like this. Like Angola, the population of Angola prison is majority black. And this is because the structure of the prison system is designed that way. It is designed to put the boot on the necks of the particular people that it is on. People will say, oh, but what are we going to do without police, right? But we cannot begin to address why crime happens. The reason crime happens is because of poverty. It's because of poor mental health support. The rich stay rich, and the rich get richer, and the poor get poorer, right? So unless we can abolish those structures, we also can't then expect police to be able to do their job, because they are out there enforcing the very structures that are creating the crime that we are seeing. That police are actually perpetuating crime, not having a hand in stopping it. Because they don't stop crime anyway. Like, a lot of people are like, what are we gonna do about serial killers? What are we gonna do about the rapists, etc., etc.? Police don't stop those. Police aren't very good at doing anything about those. So we've basically got a system that doesn't work as is, and we've got police. And that's their whole job. We've got an entire group of people where their whole job is supposedly preventing and investigating these things when they happen, and they don't even manage to do that. So why do they exist? It's because they are there to enforce the power structures that be, and they are the attack dogs of the state and of the ruling class. Cops are hired to protect capital. Easy as that. Yes. They're hired to protect capital, and they're hired to protect class interests, ruling class interests. That is what they're doing. We know this because they don't solve crimes. They don't do any of their job. In case none of you have ever sort of critically looked at the sort of cop shows that we all consume quite, you know, unconsciously, remember that this is why propaganda is bad. It's because by watching propaganda, it is reinforcing this sort of manufactured consent. A lot of people just sort of tacitly assume that we need police, that we need police to keep people safe. But they don't keep people safe. Crime is super high, violent crime is never prosecuted, and cops, when shit goes wrong, they rely on manufacturing consent and words like reform and rebuilding trust in order to manufacture that consent with the people once again, to make us think that we need cops. But we don't, because they don't do the job that they're supposedly their one job is to do. You've got police, you've got problems. I've got 99 problems, and it's all police. Not to mention their ranks are extremely racist, misogynistic, homophobic. It's pathetic, exactly. Because again, if you're going to be given infinite power by the state, what else are you gonna be except for homophobic and misogynistic and racist? When you are trained to be a hammer, everything looks like a nail.